first thing that I'll do, I'll explain this concept, what is research methodology, and what is a paradigm, followed by the research design, sampling, data collection and analysis, and then I'll finish off with the research ethics. The first question that the first concept that I'll explain is what is research. Like I said, I'm starting off by defining some of the terminologies that are used in research, so that when I refer to them, you know exactly what they mean. Because researchers come from different traditions, so they may define research concept differently. So I'll start off by defining what research is. Research is a process of investigating, scrutinizing, and studying an issue, usually conducted according to a set of predetermined guidelines and procedures. It's a process of systematic inquiry with the purpose of gaining more insight. The reason we do research is because we want to solve problems, we want to gain more insight. According to Saunders and others, it is a systematic collection and interpretation of information with a clear purpose to finding things out. So basically, when you look at these three definitions that I've provided, they all say research is about predetermined or guided. It uses clearly defined steps. It's not done haphazardly. So it's a process of investigating. It's a way of understanding the world, and it follows a systematic procedure. So the question that we may ask is research always problem solving based? And the answer is yes, research is always solving problem. And like I said, it's an investigation, or it's a process of investigation that aims to solve problem. So it is always systematic, which means it's done in a controlled and not controlled in a specific manner. It follows certain rules and procedures, and it's empirical, and also it's scientific. So what do we mean by saying research is a scientific method? So what exactly is a scientific method? Scientific method refers to a standardized set of techniques for building scientific knowledge, such as how to make valid observation, how to interpret results, and how to generalize those results. Scientific method allow researchers to independently and impartially test pre-existing theories and prior findings and subject them to open debate, modification, or enhancement. So for us to say research is scientific, it has to satisfy the four key characteristics. Number one, it has to be logical, which means scientific inferences must be based on logical principles of reasoning. It has to be, the second one, it has to be confirmable, which suggests that inferences derived must match with observed evidence. The third one is it has to be repeatable. So other researchers need to replicate or repeat the study that you have conducted. So which means you need to explain your methodology in detail so that other people can be able to replicate what you have done and obtain similar, if not identical, results. It has to be scrutinizable. This means that procedures and results should be open to public scrutiny by fellow experts or professionals. So your result must be made public so that people can challenge them, can expand them, change them, or even revise them. That's what we mean by saying they have to be scrutinizable. Other researchers need to critique whatever outcome that you have in your study. Another concept that I would like to explain is what is social science research. So social science research is a method to uncover social happening in human society. Through social science research, new knowledge is generated to help societies progress and adapt to change. So basically, social science is about solving problems that people encounter. Social scientists, they try to understand the complex nature of the society, and they challenge the existing knowledge. So simply put, social science research is research on social issues and social life. So that's what social science research is. So what is methodology? In most cases, student confuses methodology with research method. Research method is about your data collection instruments, but research methodology signals to the reader how the research was conducted and what was philosophical assumptions and what philosophical assumptions underpin the research. This is according to these authors. Research methodology is the general approach a researcher takes in carrying out a research project. So basically, research methodology encompasses your paradigm, your approaches, your design, your data collection, and your data analysis. So that's what we're saying. It's a general approach a researcher takes in carrying out a research project. And the last concept that I will define is a paradigm. What is a research paradigm? A research paradigm represents a particular worldview that defines for the researchers who hold this view what is acceptable to research and how this could be done. So working within a particular paradigm determines choices such as the following: what kind of questions are supposed to be asked, what can be observed and investigated, and how to collect data to interpret the findings. And how to collect data and how to interpret the findings. So those questions are based on what will be determined by your choice of the paradigm. So if you are a positivist or post-positivist researcher, or you are a constructivist researcher, the way you formulate your research questions will be different, and even how you collect data. For example, for the post-positivist, they collect data using the surveys and whereas the constructivist, they use interviews and so on to collect data. We have 3 distinct approaches to research. The first one is quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method. I'll talk to each of these in brief. According to Saunders and the others, there are 3 approaches to theory development, which are induction, deduction, and abduction. And in their view, the qualitative, the quantitative, and the mixed method are the methodological choices, not research approaches. So, like I was saying when I started, that it depends how I said different researchers come from different traditions, so how they define research might be different. So this is one example of the difference that I was talking about. So they talk about the inductive approach, which is the approach to theory development involving the development of a theory as a result of observation and empirical data. Deductive approach is the approach to theory development involving the testing of a theoretical position by the employment of research strategies specifically designed for the purpose of its testing. Whereas the abductive approach is an approach to theory development involving the collection of data to explore a phenomenon, identifying themes, and explaining patterns. So usually the inductive approach is used in qualitative research, but there are some qualitative research that also uses deductive approach. Deductive approach is predominantly used by quantitative researchers, and then abductive approach, we're talking about the mixed method researchers, or researchers that uses the mixed method research approach. But we'll talk more deeply about these approaches when we talk about data analysis. So what is qualitative research? Or no, what is quantitative research? Quantitative research is research that focuses on the gathering of numeric data or data in numerical form. That is data in the form of numbers, and it is deductive. It is said to be objective and situated within a framework of positivism. Remember, the goal of positivism is to describe, to control, and to predict. So basically, the positivists claim that there is one truth, and the world can be known completely. So basically, they use what we call deductive reasoning. So quantitative research is a means of testing objective theories by examining the relationship among the variable. According to Bryan and Bell, quantitative research is research that usually emphasizes quantification in the collection and analysis of data, as well as a research strategy that is deductivist and objectivist and incorporates a natural science method, science model of the research. So basically, they're saying quantitative research is deductive and is objective, and it incorporates a natural science model of research. So when do we choose a quantitative approach? As a researcher, you need to make up your mind which method are you going to use in your study. So these are some guidelines as to that will help you to decide on the research method that that you would want to choose. So it makes sense that the way we see the world will influences the way in which we as researchers, the way we research. So if for example, you see the world in using a positivist eye, then that's basically how you will do your research. So that's why I'm saying it makes sense that the way we see the world influences the way in which we research the world. So for choosing a quantitative approach, these are the guidelines that you want to use, or we use this method when most of the conditions apply. The first one is that the research is confirmatory rather than exploratory. Basically, here we want to you have the hypothesis, so we want to confirm those hypotheses, or we are trying to measure a trend, which is almost impossible with the qualitative research. There is no ambiguity about the concept we measure. The only way to measure its concept. The concept is being measured on a ratio or ordinal scale. So these are the conditions under which you can use your quantitative research approach. So let me talk briefly on what is qualitative research. It's a method of naturalistic inquiry. It aims to study people in their natural setting. In their natural social setting. The focus is on meanings that participants in the study setting attached to their social world. That is why in most instances we're saying in qualitative research, as a researcher, you see the world through the eyes of your participants. So your participants are the most important people in qualitative research, whereas in quantitative research, the researcher is the one who dominates the research, because she's the one who will have to predict, make prediction, and so on and so on. But with quantitative research, the participant occupies a central space. Qualitative researchers believe that if we are to understand a topic or a title, we need to look at you need to look at it through the eyes of those who experience it, and try to understand it from their point of view. For example, if you want to understand how is life of the drug addict, you need to talk to those people so that you can understand their life. Or if you want to understand how learners experience bullying in the school, you need to talk to learners and get to understand how they experience. You can't talk to teachers, for example, if you want to know how learners experience bullying. You need to talk to the people who are experiencing it, because like I said, we need to look at the phenomenon through the eyes of those who are experiencing it and try to understand it from their point of view. Qualitative research is yielding information that cannot be easily reduced to numbers. Remember, with quantitative, we said the information that we get is in terms of numbers. That's why in most cases, quantitative research will say, 50 people are saying this and that. But with quantitative, the number is not an issue. We even want to know that dissenting voice, that one person who says something different. That information it's critical for qualitative researchers. It typically involves an in-depth examination of a complex phenomenon. So qualitative research examines phenomenon within the cultural and social context in which it takes place. So with qualitative research, context is important, because with qualitative, we don't generalize, as opposed to quantitative, which uses generalization. So with qualitative, we're saying context is important. What people experience in context A might be different or will be different if the context changes. So that's why it's important always to define your context if you are a qualitative researcher. So when do we choose, or when do we use qualitative research? So you choose or you select qualitative method when most of these conditions apply. Number one, you have no existing research data on the topic. So if what you want to research is unknown, you can use qualitative research. If the problem or the issue needs to be explored, or you're exploring reason why people do or believe something. You can use qualitative research when you want to empower people to share their stories or hear their stories, because, for example, with qualitative, we use data collection methods such as interviews. So with interviews, for example, you will be able to understand how people, do what, or maybe their reason for doing things. When you want to develop a theory, you can use a qualitative research, and you can use qualitative research when quantitative measures do not fit the problem. So these are the conditions under which you can choose to use qualitative research. So what are the similarities between qualitative and quantitative in quantitative social research? So with quantitative, their similarities is that they use they all derive information from the data. They derive new information, and that information can come from the data. With qualitative, for example, they validate the data that they have, whereas with quantitative, they develop a theory, like I said. So justification of the findings with qualitative, and both qualitative and quantitative, they are both subjected to research bias, in terms of data collection method or sampling bias, for example. The limitations, limited by variables being studied, both of them, and then the research procedure, they are both scientific in nature. So what are the differences between the two, the quantitative and the qualitative? When you look at the level of analysis, quantitative is objective. Like I said, they are saying there's only one reality, whereas or one truth. With qualitative, they're saying there are multiple realities, which means they look from multiple sources. Objective, we're saying this is the one truth. People do things because of A, whereas with qualitative, we're saying people do or they act the way they do because of, there might be different reasons why people do things. For example, when people, for example, are attending a funeral, for example, we assume and we see them crying. The assumption is that these people are crying because the quantitative, they use assumption. They will assume that, you know, these people are crying because they are sad. But the quantitative researcher who's subjective is saying, you know what, they might not necessarily crying because they are sad. There are different reasons why they are crying. One of the reasons could be, you know, they're crying because they lost a friend. You know, they're crying because they lost a, you know, somebody's crying because, you know, the person who died owes him or her money. Now he's thinking, now this person is gone, I'm not going to get my money anymore. Or maybe, you know, somebody's crying because he lost a friend, or he lost a, you know, there's so many reasons why people do things. So that's what objective means, and that's the view of the qualitative researchers. They're saying there is multiple truth. And then when you look at the population size with the quantitative, they can use a large sample. You know, they can, for example, when they use the surveys, they can survey 1,000 people or like large numbers, whereas with qualitative usually use small numbers. Small numbers, you know, you can conduct research at, you know, for example, if you're doing an ethnographic study, you can use you know, just one person, and that's enough. So they're not concerned with numbers. Level of reality deductive, and then with qualitative is inductive. Research instruments in quantitative are more rigid. For example, if you use survey, that surveys, whereas with qualitative we use it's more flexible in terms of the choice of the choice of the research instrument. You know, you can decide that, you know what, I was thinking that I will only interview these people, but I think also I need to interview them and observe them in the different contexts. So with a qualitative researcher has that space, has that flexibility, whereas the quantitative researcher, they in terms of their research instrument, they're more rigid. And then the purpose of quantitative research is to quantify data and generalize the results from a sample to the population of interest. And another purpose is to test a theory, whereas with qualitative, the purpose or the aim is to build a theory. They don't test the theory, and the aim is to gain an understanding of the underlying reasons and motivation. That's why I said for qualitative researchers, they look at why people do things the way they do them. So to gain a complete understanding of a phenomenon under study, you can use a qualitative research, whereas if you want to generalize your result or you want to test the theory that is there, that's why we say with quantitative, they use deductive method because they use the data that is already there. That's why we talk about testing a theory rather than building a theory. With quantitative, we're saying there's no data that exists, or they are building that theory. So those are the similarities, I mean, the differences of quantitative and qualitative approach. So basically, there's no approach that is superior to the other. In order to decide which approach you want to use, you need to look at the paradigm. Remember, I said the paradigm is your world view. So if you are a post-positivist or your positivist researcher or your interpretivist researcher, that will determine which method you want to use. And what is the purpose of your study? Do you want to build a theory, or you want to test the theory? And then the research questions that you want to, what is the research question that you want to use? So the basic aim of quantitative research is to, for example, if you're doing a qualitative research, the aim is to get an in-depth understanding of the phenomenon. That's why when you do your problem statement, not your purpose statement, you use words such as you want to explore, you want to describe, you seek to understand, and you know, and always your questions will start with how, and also, you know, you start with the question, how do people experience, how do you experience this phenomenon? So that's what the quantitative, the qualitative researchers will say. But the quantitative researchers, they use words like, what is the effect of this? What is the impact? How does this compare to this? What are the best ways of improving, for example, reading among learners? Those are the verbs that we usually use when we are using quantitative research. Just to wrap the discussion around quantitative and qualitative, understanding the difference between qualitative and the quantitative help in choosing an appropriate design, in balancing the two approaches, and formulating the research questions and hypotheses, and also helps in analyzing the data, your interpretation, and the presentation of your findings. Because how you present the qualitative data and the quantitative data, it's going to be different. Remember, I said with qualitative, the data is presented in words, whereas in quantitative, the data is presented in numbers. So let's talk about the last approach, which is the mixed method. The mixed method is the research in which the investigator or the researcher collects and analyzes data, integrates the findings, and draw inferences using both qualitative and quantitative approaches or method in a single study. So in a mixed method research, in a mixed method research, the researcher incorporates both the qualitative and the quantitative method of data collection and analysis in a single study. So what are the characteristics of a mixed method? Because in some instances, student confuses the mixed method and purely qualitative and quantitative method. Doesn't mean when you, for example, you're using in your study, you're using your interviews and you also having a questionnaire. That does not necessarily make your study a mixed method research. So it could be that you're using your other method just to validate the result that you're going to get from the other method, or you're using the different method for the purpose of triangulation, not necessarily using it as a mixed method. So what are the characteristics of a mixed method? It involves the collection of both qualitative and quantitative data in response to the research questions or hypotheses. So which means you should have both the questions that addresses the quantitative aspect and those that addresses the qualitative aspect of your research. And it includes the analysis of both forms of data. So if you have qualitative data, you need to analyze it. And if you have and you also need to analyze the quantitative data. The procedures for both qualitative and quantitative data collections and analysis need to be conducted rigorously. So this suggests that if you want to use a mixed method research, you need to clearly understand what qualitative research is, what are the methods that are used, what are the designs that are used. The same with quantitative. You need to understand both of them clearly because data collection and analysis need to be conducted rigorously, and you can only do that if you understand the two methods clearly. The two forms of data are integrated in the design analysis through merging the data, connecting the data, and embedding the data. Remember, the data that you receive from the qualitative research need to talk to the data that you have in quantitative. So you need to use cross-referencing and so that's why I'm saying you need to have clear competence for both methods of data collection. These procedures can be informed by a philosophical worldview or a theory. So this is according to Creswell. Let me move on to the research design. What is the research design? Research design is a comprehensive plan for data collection in an empirical research project. It enables the reader to judge the extent to which using the design would adequately answer the research question. And it is a blueprint for empirical research aimed at answering specific research questions or testing specific hypotheses. A research design stipulates who or what to be studied, when, how, and for what purpose. It's a general plan of how to conduct the research process, particularly on answering research questions. So basically, a research design is like a roadmap. In a roadmap, you'll get names of the routes that are there, names of cities or towns. You will see it will give you the tourist attraction or places of historical interest or leisure places, and also mileage from one place to another. So that's why I'm saying I'm giving you this analogy of a roadmap. So basically, that's what the research design. It will tell you what is studied, who is studied, when is those phenomenon studies, how are they going to be studied, and for what purpose. That's what a research design is about. So a research design must specify your data collection processes, the instrument that you're going to to use, and your sampling method. They need to be specified in your research design. So according to Punch, and I don't know how to pronounce this, they say a good research design is a basic plan. As a basic plan raises 4 main critical questions. The first question is, what strategies should be followed? So these are the questions that should be answered by your research design. What strategy should be followed, which means are you going to use the qualitative research, quantitative, or a quantitative method? So the choice depends on the purpose, your research question, and the type of data that you require. The second question is, within what theoretical framework? So ideally, a research design should be anchored on a theoretical framework which informs and gives direction to the study. And the third question is, who or what is to be studied? So here we're talking about your participant or the phenomenon that is under study. And then the last question is the tools and procedures to be used for collecting data and analyzing data, answering the how question, who or what to be studied. So these are the 4 questions that are critical for a good research design, according to this. So I will discuss with you different design in different research methods. I'll start with the qualitative design. So we have 5 qualitative research design. There are others, but we will only focus on these 5. We have ethnography as a qualitative design. So ethnography has its roots in cultural anthropology. It's about an analysis of data that talks about cultural groups. The aim of using ethnography is to develop a cultural theory. So which means if you want to study people's culture, then your design is going to be a ethnographic design. But choosing an ethnographic design, you need to remember, when you want to study people's culture, we're talking about, people's way of life. You need to have time, because you have to spend most of your time with the participant or the population that you want to study. And it's important that you understand the language of the population or the participant that you want to research on, because you know culture and language, they go hand in hand. If you don't understand my language, how are you going to understand my culture? So your choice of your design need to, if for example you want to use ethnographic design, you need to make sure that you understand the language of your participant. And then we have phenomenology as another qualitative design. Phenomenology aim at understanding the participant views and opinions from their lived experiences. So if you want to understand how people experience a particular phenomenon, then your design will be phenomenology. But and then the other one is grounded theory. This is it aims at generating a theory. So if you want to generate a theory based on your data that you collected, you use grounded theory. And then case study, use case study when you want to study or when you want a complete understanding of a phenomenon, or want to use what we call an in-depth investigation of a particular phenomenon, then you can use a case study. And then the last one, we have the narrative design. This is the studies the life of individuals. So in a narrative design, we're saying a participant is a narrator. So here the participant will be telling. Narrative design basically called a story design, because the participant in this design is a narrator and the researcher is a listener and facilitate the narration process. So the participant is the one who will be telling you stories, and your role as a researcher is to listen. And then let's move on to quantitative design. Quantitative design, we have descriptive design, which are used in observational studies, in correlation studies, and in survey research. And then we've got developmental designs. These ones, they examine the changes that happens over time. And then we have experimental design. It involves the manipulation of the independent variable and observing its effect on the dependable variable. We've got the ex post facto design and case study design. Even in qualitative, we do have the case study design. So writing up your research design section in your chapter, the first thing that you need to do is to identify the design that you will be using. We talked briefly about the quantitative design and the qualitative design. So decide the one that you want to use. And remember, I indicated that your choice will be determined by your philosophical underpinning, and also the purpose of the study. That will help you to decide which one you want to use. So firstly, you have to, when you write up the section, you have to identify the design that you'll be using, provide some background information about the design, that is, talk about its origin, its application, and a brief definition. Show whoever will be reading your section that you know what you're talking about. If you have chosen a narrative design, tell us what the narrative design is. What is its origin, and when do we apply this narrative design, and give a definition of what the narrative design is, or what the phenomenology design is. And then you provide the rationale. So here you need to provide the reason why you think that particular design is appropriate or relevant for your study. That's what providing the rationale means. Lastly, identify how the use of the design will shape many aspects of the research, such as the title, the problem, research question, data collection, and analysis. Basically, here you telling us how the design that you have chosen will help you to answer the research question. Whatever you do in research, whatever method of data collection you're choosing, whatever design you're choosing, or whoever participant you're choosing, they need to help you to answer the research question. That's the purpose of conducting the research. You want to answer the research question that you have identified. So show us how the method is going to help you answer that research question. So the next aspect that I want us to talk about is sampling. What is sampling? So according to this writer, sampling is the process of who will participate in the study. It involves making decisions about the people, the setting, the events or behaviors to include in the study. So even the setting need to be you need to tell us where will your study take place and why have you chosen and how did you decide on that context, or how did you decide on that setting that you have chosen? For example, if you're doing research in a particular school, in a primary school, tell us how did you sample that primary school? We have 50 primary school in a district, so how did you sample this one primary school that you are focusing on? So that is about sampling. Sampling design. A sample design refers to the methods to use to choose a sample from the population. Poor sample plans can produce misleading information. So I cannot overemphasize the importance of sampling in a research project. Before you collect the data, you need to design an appropriate sampling plan. Decisions about the mode of data collection and the sampling plan are done at the same time as these influence each other and are dependent upon the unit of analysis and resources available. You need to choose the design of the sample, including the size of the sample, so that the sample provides sufficient information to meet the objective. Sampling in different paradigms. Post-positivist paradigm, sampling is concerned. The concern is on representativeness and generalization. So that's what post-positivists are doing. The interpretivist and critical in interpretivism focuses on collecting rich, in-depth qualitative data. Post-positivists are using quantitative data. So like I said, their concern is for generalization, whereas in qualitative, the concern is not on generalizing. That's why I said context with qualitative is important, because whatever information or the theory that you are going to generate from your study will only be relevant to your particular context in a qualitative study, whereas in quantitative it's different. How do you selecting the sample size? How do you determine the sample size? How do you know as a researcher that this size it's enough? Or if I've chosen 5 participants in a qualitative study, this will be enough. Or if I've chosen 100 participants in a quantitative study, this will be enough for my study. So how do you determine the sample size? I must say there's no clear-cut answer to this question of a sample size, since it depends on the purpose of your study. Or what do you want to achieve? What is the objective of your study? Do you want to generalize? If you want to generalize, therefore you can't use a small sample because you want to generalize. If you just want to understand a phenomenon, you know, that's what I'm saying. The sample size depend on the purpose of the study. That size is also determined by the data collection method and the style of the researcher, the data collection method. So it's like I said, it depends on the purpose of your study. That will determine the size that you will use. So how big is the sample? If the sample is too large, you know, you need to ask yourself, will that waste, you know, will it be a waste of time to do that? Or do you have time to do that? Do you have resources? Do you have money? And if it's too few, that can also lead to inaccurate results, because you cannot, for example, generalize the results that you have, you know, but that you have only sampled few people or whatever, then you say everybody, whereas you only sampled a few individuals. So that's a very tricky situation, but you need to navigate around that. Like I said, the best way is to look at the purpose of your study. What is it that you want to achieve? What is your objective? So like I said, the sample size depend on the purpose of the study, your paradigm. Paradigm, remember, I said, is your worldview. Do you believe that there's only one truth there, or you believe there's multiple truths, or whatever your paradigm is, and your data collection methods. Like I said, there are no rules. I mean, in qualitative research, there are no rules for sample size. The size depends on what we want to know, the purpose of inquiry, and what will be useful, the time and the resources. So you have to look at all this in order to determine the sample size. Do you have the resources? Do you have the money? Do you have time to do that, to conduct the research? If, for example, you want to study how, you know, you want to study the phenomenon of widowhood, so you need to in South Africa, so you need to check, do you have the money to go to all the provinces in South Africa if you want to generalize your results, or you want to just talk about in a particular province within a particular district or whatever. But you know, those things you need to consider before deciding on your sample. So how do you select the sample size in a quantitative study? So these are the guidelines for identifying a sufficient sample size in a quantitative study. So these are the guidelines. If population is 100 or fewer, do not sample, but rather take the whole population as your sample. Here, this is for the quantitative researchers. If the population size is around 500, so 50% should be sampled. If the population size is around 1,500, 20% should be sampled. Beyond a certain point, the population size is almost irrelevant, and a sample of 500, 400 will be adequate. So this is the suggestions by Gill, Mills, and Arizona 2012. These are the suggestions if you are a quantitative researcher. Sometimes sample size depend on the homogeneity or the heterogeneity of the population. Statisticians have developed formulas to determine the required sample size depending on the nature of the study and the population. So there are scientific methods that can help you to determine your sample size if you are using a quantitative study. So we've got two types of sampling. We've got probability sampling and we have non-probability. So probability sampling is that sampling that is used by quantitative researchers. It's a technique in which every unit in the population has a chance of being selected in the sample, and this chance can be accurately determined. All probability sampling has two attributes in common. Every unit in the population has a known non-zero probability of being sampled, and the sampling procedures involve random selection at some point. So that's the probability sampling. And then non-probability sample in qualitative, probability sampling in quantitative, we have these types of sampling. In quantitative, we've got simple random sampling, we've got systematic sampling, we've got stratified sampling, cluster sampling, and we have multi-stage sampling. So these are the sampling methods that are used by quantitative researchers. I'm not going to explain these methods. Then non-probability sampling, these are sampling that is done in qualitative research. It's a sampling technique in which some units of the population have zero chance of selection, or where the probability of selection cannot be accurately determined. So that's the difference between probability and non-probability sampling. Typically, units are selected based on a certain non-random criteria such as quota or convenience. So which means with qualitative sampling is done based on what we call the rich informant, or we're saying you choose a participant because the participant has a particular criteria. For example, if you want to understand the culture of paying in among the Zulu people, you need to go to people. You need to go to the Zulu people, Zulu speaking people, and talk to them about that. So you need to choose people that you think will have that information. You can't just ask any other person or any other Zulu for that matter. You need to consult people, maybe the elders or whoever, people that you think they will know, they will have the information. So with qualitative, we choose participants because they satisfy a particular criteria. It can be convenience or quota. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. Because the selection is non-random, non-probability sampling does not allow the estimation of sample errors and may be subjected to sampling bias. It's possible that when you choose your participants, you may be accused of being biased, because the question is, if, for example, you're using specialists in a particular field, are you saying these are the only specialists in that field? And the answer is no, there are other specialists. So why have you chosen this one over that one? So sampling bias, it's bound to happen when you are a qualitative researcher. And the information from a sample cannot be generalized back to the population. So that's what I discussed earlier. Sampling method in qualitative research. We've got the snowball. Snowball basically it's about the referrals. If you want to study, drug use among the youth in a particular town, and you don't know, chances are you might not know you might not know them in your town. You might know one or two of them. So with snowball, we're saying one, and then this one will refer you to the other one, and this one will refer to another one. So that's how you increase the sample size in your qualitative research. Remember, with qualitative, I said the sample size does not matter. So you might not necessarily even indicate the number of participants that, or you can indicate, I want to use 5 participants, but it doesn't mean you have to at the end stick with the 5 people that you set out to interview, for example. So snowballing, like I said, they're giving the referrals to increase the sample size, and then convenience sampling is that sampling that involves convenience sampling is that sampling that talks about having access to, or sometimes access to your participants. Sometimes it's called the accident or the opportunity sampling, which this is a technique in which a sample is drawn from the part of the population that is that's closer to you, or that are readily available, you know, or those that agreed to participate in the study. And then key information, talking about those that have special skills and, or, you know, special information. So what are the do's and the don'ts in choosing your sample size? When you choose your sample size, make sure that you talk to the right people. Don't give work to others which you could do for yourself. For example, policy, you have to, don't ask your participant to be doing this kind of work in your sample as you choose your sample. Plan carefully the involvement of children and young people. Get accent and consent. So these are just tips on things that you need to consider when you choose your sample. So this is just a summary of the different this is just a summary of the qualitative these are the qualitative sampling method and your design. For example, if you are ethnographic, so like I said, the focus of ethnographic design is on the context or the culture of the population. So the population size doesn't matter really. And then your data collection is instrument would be your observation and interviews. With narrative, you can have 1 or 2. The sample size, you can have 1 or 2 individuals. Phenomenology, you can have 225. When you're doing a grounded theory, you can have 20 to 60. A case study, you can have as many people as you wish. So let's talk about data collection. I'm not sure how I'm doing with time. Data collection, this includes observation, interviews, and experimentation. After the research objective has been specified and the population identified and the list of needed information has been prepared, the researcher should determine whether such information is already available either in company records or in outside resources. Thus, one should select the mode of data collection to be used. So some data is already available. It's readily available. For example, you know, it's you know, if you're going to to use the policies or records, they are there. The choice of one or combination of these most depend on the planning decisions such as the research objective, unit of analysis, sampling plan, resources availability like time, funding, and assistance. In this case, identification of available resources done and any limitation should be identified. There's no best way on collecting data, on which method of data collection you should use. The decision to use a particular method will depend on what you need to know. Do you want numbers? Do you want your data in the form of numbers, or you want it as stories? Where is the data? Where does the data reside? Is it in the files or in the environment or in people? What resources do you have? What time do you have? And the complexity of data to be collected. So, because in some instances when you're doing research that's researching sensitive topics, so you need to consider those things. Frequency of data collection, intended forms of data analysis. So these are the things that you need to consider. So what are the data collection methods that we have in both qualitative and quantitative? We have interviews, observation, documents. So here we're talking about public minutes. Public documents such as minutes of minutes of the meeting. I wanted to say meeting, sorry about that typo. The newspapers, the private documents, the journals, the diaries, and so on. Audiovisual materials, talking about photographs, videotapes, art object, And then for quantitative, you're talking about the questionnaires, the surveys, and experimentation. So these are the data collection methods that we have. So I'll talk briefly about interviews. I'm not going to talk about each of them because we don't have much time. So interviews, we've got 3 types of interviews. We have structured and semi-structured and unstructured interview. So structured interview is that interview where every participant is going to get the same questions, and then semi-structured, they have that flexibility. The researcher has the flexibility to change the questions, and also can use probing, for example. So we use both open-ended questions and provide for the researcher and the participant to discuss certain topics in detail. So with semi-structured, you can do what you call probing or follow-up. For example, you can have a question like, does the child have fever? This is a closed question. So you can, with qualitative, we don't use question like this because the answer could be, we don't use yes or no question. But with qualitative, we use probing. So the question can then be, how high is the fever? Or since when he has the fever? So these are the type of questions that one can use. So we have unstructured, and then we have focus group. So focus group, we use it when we have large number of individuals. What are the ethical issues in interviews? Before you conduct interview, make sure that your participants sign the informed consent. This is important because they need to understand why they are participating and what is the benefit of their participation in the study. So they need to understand all the details about your study. Confidentiality, assure them that they whatever they will be discussing with you will not be discussed outside your meeting, and they will be used for, or the result will be just used for the purpose of your research. Autonomy. Here we say interviews have the right to privacy. Allow them to withdraw if they want to. Do not force them to talk. If you are, in the interview and your participant don't want to talk, you cannot force them. If you ask them a question, they say no, I'm not going to answer that one. They have that right to refuse, if I may use the word, to talk. Beneficence, act in the best interest of the participants, and non-maleficence, make sure that you don't harm your participant, avoid harm to your participant. Data analysis, what is it? I'm just going to run, we don't have much time. Data analysis, it's about organizing, accounting for, and explaining the data. So that's what analysis is. You've collected data, either quantitative or qualitative, but that data need to be analyzed. You need to talk to it. So in qualitative, we're saying you're making sense of the data that you have collected. So approaches to analysis, we have inductive. Remember, I did talk about this concept when I started: inductive, deductive, and abductive. So with deductive, we're saying you move from the data to the theory. We use data to develop a theory. With deductive, we're saying we're moving from the theory to the data. But abductive, we are moving back and forth from data to theory, theory to data. So how do you get good qualitative research results when you analyze? That depends on, the first thing is getting good qualitative results depend on the quality of the collector, of the data collector. So that means remember with qualitative, I said as a researcher, you also play an important role. Your listening skills, do you listen to your participants? You need to give your participants space to talk. Don't always, interfere or talk on their behalf. They are the ones who are important in data collection. your interpersonal skills, how you relate to them, your observational skills, the quality of data analyzers. Here we talk about how you, because you'll be the one who will be interpreting your data. So how do you analyze your data? And again, quantitative analysis, which is statistics driven and largely independent of the researcher. Qualitative analysis is heavily dependent on the researcher's analytic and integrative skills and personal knowledge of the social context where the data is collected. The emphasis on qualitative analysis is sense-making or understanding a phenomenon, rather than predicting or explaining, as in quantitative. So with qualitative, we want to make sense. What, like when you have the data, when you have collected the data, the question that you ask yourself is, what am I getting from this data? What, like I said, you have to make sense of the data. What is this data saying? So a creative and investigating mindset is needed for qualitative analysis based on the ethically in-line participant in context attitude and a set of analytic strategies. So what are the categories of qualitative data analysis? So here we're talking about content analysis in the systematic analysis of the content of a text. For example, when you do content analysis of your data, you look at who says what to whom, why, and to what extent, and with what in a qualitative or in a quantitative manner. Whereas narrative analysis involves the reformulation of stories. Remember, I said narrative is about stories. So you reformulate the stories presented by participants, taking into consideration the context of each and different experiences of each participant. Discourse analysis is a method that involves analyzing a naturally occurring tone in all type of written text. Vocabulary, the tone, the voice, how participants initiate response to a dialogue. For example, if your participants are expressing excitement, you look at the exact words that they are using. You know, where they're saying, I was happy, I was excited, I was intrigued, I was, whatever word that they use. That's what discourse analysis is. You look at how the choice of words that were used by your participant, that is important for a discourse. I mean, in discourse analysis. Thematic analysis is a method for identifying, analyzing, organizing, describing, and reporting themes found within a data set. Then we have document analysis. It's a systematic procedure for reviewing or evaluating documents. Quantitative data analysis, we're saying the numeric data collected in the research project can be analyzed quantitatively using statistical tools in two different ways. Like for the quantitative, they have, but even in qualitative, there are some statistical methods that you can use. You can use in vivo and so on to analyze the data. So here we talk about quantitative, we talk about descriptive analysis and inferential analysis. So what are the ethical principles in a scientific research? Participants should be privy to the information such as who is conducting the study, for what purpose, what outcomes are expected, and who will benefit from the results. So these are the ethical consideration that as a researcher, whether qualitative, quantitative, or a mixed method researcher, you need to adhere to make sure that your participants have information about your research. What is the purpose of your study? What outcomes are expected, and who is going to benefit from the study, and how are they going to, if they are going to benefit from the study, how are they going to benefit? That information needs to be disclosed. Some of the expected tenets of ethical behavior that are widely accepted within the scientific community are as follows. Number one, voluntary participation and harmlessness. I think I did talk about those. The informed consent. The second one would be respect for anonymity and confidentiality. Anonymity or readers of a final research report or paper cannot identify a given response with a specific respondent. Please note that truthful responses may not be obtained if subjects are not assured of anonymity. So if your participants are not comfortable in disclosing the information because they're not sure if you're going to share it with whoever, they might not give you truthful responses. So it is important to ensure that you guarantee your participant some confidentiality in whatever that will be shared with them. I think I will pause here.